The image of a Viking journey is burned into our imagination. A sleek longship slicing across stormy seas, dragon-headed prow cutting through waves, while fierce warriors chant in unison, oars slapping rhythmically against the water. The stories make it sound like adventure and glory came naturally to these seafaring people. To travel as a Viking was to become a hero. To raid was to prove your strength. To trade was to return home with wealth and status. But the truth is much darker. Because the Vikings didn't only set sail for riches and fame, and not every journey ended with roaring feasts, overflowing mead horns, and songs of victory. In fact, the most dangerous journeys they undertook were often the ones nobody wrote sagas about. Journeys so brutal, so unforgiving, and so thankless that entire generations of Norsemen feared them more than battle itself. And yet, without these perilous journeys, the Viking Age would never have happened. Part 1. The Myth of Viking Journeys. At its core, Viking culture was about movement. They were a people who rarely stayed still. Whether driven by hunger, ambition, trade, exploration, or conquest, Vikings were always on the move. Ships were the lifeblood of this culture, but so were overland routes, river crossings, mountain passes, and frozen trails. Every Viking was expected to travel at some point in their life. A farmer might leave his homestead to barter wool, cheese, and animal hides in a nearby market. A warrior might travel to pledge service to a chieftain in another fjord. A young man might set out on a raiding expedition to prove his worth, or die trying. Even the women and children were not exempt, often relocating entire households when alliances shifted or when a settlement had to uproot itself in search of better land. But travel in the Viking world was nothing like what we imagine today. There were no roads stretching reliably across the land, no sturdy bridges over rivers, no warm inns offering beds and food. Instead, Viking journeys were gambles with death. A sudden storm could sink a ship. A broken ankle in the wilderness could mean starvation. A poorly planned route could leave you stranded in waist-deep snow with nothing but a fur cloak. And then there were the enemies, rival clans, wild animals, and the ever-present threat of betrayal. In short, every step away from home was a risk. The glorious raids versus the forgotten journeys. When we think of Vikings, we think of raids. And for good reason, the raids terrified Europe. In 793, the infamous attack on Lindisfarne in Northumbria shocked the Christian world. Villages were burned, monasteries stripped bare, and captives dragged away in chains. These raids became the stuff of legend, and skalds, the poets of the Viking world, sang of them for centuries. But not all Viking journeys were celebrated. The sagas are strangely quiet about the endless, grueling treks across bogs and forests to reach markets or distant allies. They do not glorify the weeks spent hauling heavy ships overland between rivers. They rarely describe the agony of slaves forced to march across hundreds of miles in chains, often dying before they ever saw the market where they would be sold. These were the journeys that built the Viking world, the unglamorous, unrecorded struggles that were essential for survival, yet too miserable to immortalize in song. And that is why they are almost forgotten today. The unseen cost of movement. The Norse had a saying, "A man without a journey is like a man without breath." But they also understood that a journey was as much a confrontation with death as it was a test of strength. Every Viking knew someone who had set out and never returned. A storm might swallow a longship whole. An ambush might slaughter a caravan on the trail. A simple misstep into an icy river could drag a man under in seconds. And these dangers weren't rare, they were expected. In fact, many Vikings believed the gods themselves watched over their travels. Odin the Wanderer was said to walk in disguise along roads, testing the hospitality of strangers. Thor the Thunderer protected travelers against the forces of chaos, his hammer warding off trolls and giants. But no matter how many charms or prayers one carried, there was no guarantee of safety. This ever-present danger made journeys a spiritual as well as physical ordeal. Leaving home was not simply about reaching another place, it was about gambling with fate. Why this journey matters most. So what was this most dangerous Viking journey that nobody talks about? It wasn't the raids across the North Sea, though those were risky. It wasn't even the famed explorations to Greenland and Vinland, though they pushed the limits of human endurance. The deadliest Viking journey was often one much closer to home, one that did not promise glory, riches, or new lands. It was the endless march across hostile wilderness, dragging cargo, livestock, or captives with no certainty of survival. It was the slaves' forced trek through snow, chains biting into flesh, never knowing if they'd live to see the end. And it was the journey after death, the soul's perilous passage to the afterlife, where even the bravest warrior could stumble. These were the journeys that terrified Vikings in ways no raid or battle ever could, and yet they were journeys every Viking either faced or feared. Part 2. The deadly pilgrimage across Viking lands. When we imagine Vikings, our minds drift toward the sea. Sleek long ships gliding over icy waters, warriors rowing in rhythm, sails catching the wind like the wings of a raven. But for every sea journey, there was another kind of travel, one far less romantic, far less celebrated, and far more dangerous. This was the overland trek. The journey across Scandinavia's brutal wilderness was, for many Vikings, the true test of survival. Raids and naval battles might earn songs in the halls of longhouses, but these silent, grinding marches consumed more lives than swords or arrows ever did. The landscape, a natural enemy. Scandinavia was a land of extremes. Towering pine forests swallowed travelers whole, stretching for days without clear paths. Jagged mountains carved the horizon, their passes choked with snow most of the year. Vast bogs bubbled beneath fragile moss, ready to swallow both men and animals in seconds. Travelers had to cross swollen rivers with icy currents strong enough to snap bones. In spring, thawing ice made the ground a slush of mud and water. In winter, blizzards blinded entire caravans, erasing trails in minutes. The Viking world was beautiful, but it was also merciless. To step into it was to step into the jaws of nature itself. Carrying the world on their backs. Unlike sea voyages where ships could hold supplies, overland journeys meant carrying everything by hand, or on the backs of animals. Families traveling to a market or new settlement loaded sleds or carts with tools, weapons, livestock, food stores, and sometimes even entire dismantled buildings. Merchants bore sacks of salt, furs, amber, and iron, heavy burdens that slowed progress to a crawl. Warriors returning from raids might drag slaves in chains, livestock tied together, and treasure chests heavy with silver. Every extra pound made the journey harder, every delay increasing the risk of starvation or ambush. Even worse, much of Scandinavia lacked usable roads. Narrow footpaths carved by deer and hunters were often the only guides. Carts broke wheels on rocks, horses stumbled in bogs, and when rivers blocked the way, there was only one option: carry everything to the other side. The portage, hauling ships over land. One of the most brutal tasks Vikings endured was portage, the hauling of ships across land to bypass rapids, waterfalls, or stretches of river that were impossible to navigate. Imagine this: a long ship weighing several tons, stripped of its sail and oars, lashed to wooden rollers. Dozens of men strain against ropes, heaving the vessel inch by inch over slippery ground. The wood groans, muscles tear, feet sink into mud. Hours pass, then days, as the ship crawls from one river system to another. This was not a rare ordeal. In their expansion eastward into Russia, Vikings known as the Varangians regularly dragged their ships between rivers, cutting across entire watersheds to reach the Black Sea. The journey from the Baltic to Constantinople, a route famed for riches, was a nightmare of portages. Chronicles speak of men collapsing from exhaustion, horses breaking legs, and raiders ambushing travelers when they were most vulnerable. To die in battle was glorious. To die crushed beneath a rolling ship in the mud? That was a fate the Skalds never sang about. The wolves and the wild. Overland journeys were not just battles against terrain, they were battles against predators. Wolves shadowed travelers at a distance, waiting for weakness. A single broken leg, a horse that collapsed, or a group forced to camp without fire could mean waking to glowing eyes circling the camp. Bears, too, lurked in the forests. A mother with cubs could tear apart even armed men. And beyond the natural predators, there were always whispers of darker things: trolls, draugr, and spirits that haunted lonely paths. Whether or not the supernatural was real didn't matter. Fear itself killed. Panic led men to scatter in storms, stumble into ravines, or abandon their supplies to flee imagined terrors. The weight of weather. No enemy was more relentless than the weather. Rain turned paths to rivers of mud. Wagons sank to their axles, oxen collapsed, and supplies rotted. Snow buried trails and suffocated travelers in drifts taller than a man. Furs soaked in melted snow became heavy with ice, freezing men where they stood. Wind howled through mountain passes, driving sleet like knives into exposed skin. Heat in summer brought swarms of biting insects, festering wounds, and dehydration. A Viking setting out on an overland journey prepared as best they could. Cloaks of wool, boots stuffed with straw for insulation, food dried and salted for longevity. But preparation only went so far. A single storm could destroy weeks of effort. The toll on the weak. Children, the elderly, and slaves suffered most on these journeys. For families moving households, children trudged alongside adults, carrying small bundles but facing the same dangers. Many fell sick from exposure or malnutrition. Some were simply left behind. Silent sacrifices to the gods of survival. Slaves endured worse. Chained together, driven by whips, they were forced to march through snow and mud until their bodies gave out. Many never reached the markets where they were meant to be sold. Their corpses fed wolves and ravens, vanishing into the wilderness without a trace. Even livestock could not always survive. Cows collapsed, sheep froze. Horses broke legs and had to be slaughtered on the trail, their meat quickly roasted to keep the living alive. Why risk it at all? Why then did Vikings undertake such punishing journeys? Because they had no choice. Trade demanded it. Scandinavia lacked vital resources like grain, wine, and luxury goods. To acquire them, merchants and families braved endless trails to reach river ports and markets. Alliances required it. Clans forged ties by visiting one another, even if it meant crossing mountains and fjords. Raiding depended on it. Treasure stolen from monasteries in England still had to be carried back across hostile land before reaching home. Expansion relied on it. Settlers who carved out farms in Iceland or Greenland first learned the art of suffering through the landscapes of their homeland. In short, the Viking Age would have collapsed without these unseen journeys. The journey within the journey. For Vikings, travel was not just physical, it was spiritual. Leaving the safety of the homestead meant stepping into a liminal space between life and death. It was a test of fate, a gamble with the Norns who wove destiny. Every campfire lit in the wilderness was a small beacon against the void. Every safe arrival at a destination was a victory over the chaos of the world. This spiritual weight explains why so many sagas describe dreams and omens before journeys. A raven flying overhead, a strange shape in the clouds, a stumble at the threshold. These could be warnings that the road ahead held doom. Yet the Vikings went anyway, because to remain still was to wither. The forgotten heroes. The skalds sang of warriors, but the real heroes were often those who endured the grind of endless miles. The farmer who carried sacks of grain through sleet to feed his village. The mother who shielded her child with her cloak as storms raged. The merchant who crossed rivers with nothing but hope that his goods would buy enough food to last the winter. Their names are lost, but their suffering built the foundations of the Viking Age. Part 3. The slaves' forced march, the Viking journey nobody chose. In the Viking imagination, travel was a mark of freedom. To sail the seas or trek across mountains meant expanding one's world, building wealth, and proving one's strength. But not all journeys were chosen. For thousands of men, women, and children taken as captives in Viking raids, travel became a nightmare. They were forced into endless marches across unfamiliar lands, chains biting their flesh, hunger gnawing their bellies, fear hollowing their eyes. If Viking traders and warriors risked overland journeys for survival, then slaves endured them for despair. This was the journey that stripped them of everything, their freedom, their dignity, and often their lives. Captured in fire and steel. Imagine a monastery on the English coast. Dawn breaks. Bells ring for prayer. Suddenly, longships appear on the horizon. The raiders charge, axes raised, torches in hand. Some monks are cut down, others are bound, dragged screaming toward the ships. Or picture a Slavic village along a riverbank. The people are gathering firewood when shouts echo through the trees. Norsemen storm in, setting huts aflame. Mothers clutch their children only to have them torn away. For the Vikings, captives were wealth. Gold and silver mattered, yes, but human lives could be sold again and again. The unlucky were marched from burning homes onto ships, and from ships onto endless roads that led deep into Scandinavia or further still into the heart of Europe and the Middle East. Thus began the slaves' forced march, chained and driven. Captives were bound in crude chains of iron or leather. Some wore heavy neck collars locked tight, attached to one another by iron rods or ropes. If one stumbled, all were dragged down. If one fell and could not rise, the others were forced to step over their body or drag them along. They carried nothing of their own. No food, no cloaks, no shoes if they were unlucky. Bare feet bled against rocks and ice. Hunger hollowed their bodies as Viking captors rationed food sparingly, keeping most for themselves. The enslaved marched not as travelers, but as cargo. Their lives were valued only in terms of how much they might fetch at market. Crossing a hostile land. For these captives, Scandinavia was an alien world. The forests were darker, the winters harsher, the mountains higher than anything they had known. In winter, they froze under snow without shelter. Many huddled together at night like animals, their breath steaming in the darkness. In spring, they stumbled through bogs and flooded rivers, their wounds festering in the filth. In summer, swarms of insects tormented them, biting until blood ran from their skin. In autumn, storms battered them, winds howling across fjords as they were ferried from one shore to another. At every stage of the journey, nature itself worked alongside the cruelty of their captors. The price of slowness. To march as a slave was to live in constant terror of being too slow. If a captive collapsed from exhaustion, there was no mercy. Vikings valued speed. A single straggler risked the entire group slowing the march, exposing them to ambush and consuming precious supplies. Some who stumbled were whipped to their feet. Others were beaten unconscious. And many, when judged worthless, were killed on the spot, throats cut, skulls split, or bodies pushed into bogs. Wolves and ravens feasted well on the trail of the slave marches. The weight of silence. The worst burden of the march was not always physical. It was the silence of memory. Every step took captives further from their homelands, from the voices of family, from the songs of their people, from the graves of their ancestors. Most knew they would never return. The sagas rarely mention the voices of these captives, but their silence echoes in the gaps of history. When merchants wrote of Viking markets teeming with slaves, they rarely described the thousands of miles those human beings had been forced to walk to get there. The slave routes of the Viking world. To understand the scale of this suffering, we must look at the routes themselves. From the British Isles to Scandinavia, captives were taken aboard ships, then marched inland to markets in Denmark and Norway. Those who survived the sea faced weeks of overland travel to reach trading hubs like Hedeby. From the Slavic lands east of the Baltic, vast numbers of Slavs, the very word slave comes from Slav, were forced westward into Viking lands or southward along rivers. Many were marched from forests into Novgorod or Kiev, and from there to Constantinople or Baghdad. Across Scandinavia itself, some captives were forced to haul goods, even dragged ships over portages. They were beaten into labor as beasts of burden, dying in the same mud where warriors once struggled. These routes were arteries of human misery, carrying thousands each year across brutal distances. The markets at journey's end. The slave marches usually ended in markets. Places like Hedeby in Denmark, Kaupang in Norway, or Birka in Sweden thrived on human trade. Foreign merchants arrived eager to buy laborers, concubines, or soldiers for hire. A young woman might be sold into a wealthy household destined for drudgery or worse. A strong man might be bought to row galleys in Byzantium. A child might be sold to desert traders in the Abbasid Caliphate, vanishing forever into the sands. For the captives, survival of the march was not freedom. It was simply the beginning of another life of bondage. The ghosts of the march. Archaeology has uncovered traces of this hidden suffering. Graves filled with shackled skeletons, neck collars of iron rusted with time, burial sites where dozens of bodies lie in mass pits, likely captives slaughtered when they became too weak to sell. These finds confirm what the sagas omit, that behind every celebrated raid there were forgotten columns of enslaved people trudging across wilderness, leaving only bones and whispers behind. Part 4. The Expedition into the Unknown. When Vikings sailed past the edge of the world. For the Vikings, travel was more than movement. It was an act of defiance against the limits of the world. They did not only sail to known ports or march to familiar markets, they pushed past the edge of maps into seas and lands where no one could guarantee survival. These journeys to Greenland, Vinland, and even rumored Arctic realms were perhaps the most dangerous of all. They weren't slave marches, nor were they ordinary trade routes. They were leaps into the abyss, expeditions into the unknown where death lurked in every wave, and where failure meant not just defeat, but vanishing without a trace. The fear of the edge. In early medieval Europe, many believed the sea had an edge. Sail too far west and your ship might tumble off into eternal darkness. The Vikings did not share this exact fear, but they knew the dangers were real. Sailors whispered of monstrous sea serpents, whales large enough to swallow ships, and islands that vanished when approached mirages born from mist. Beyond Iceland lay seas choked with ice, winds that cut like blades, and nights that lasted for months. To venture into those waters was to risk not just storms, but the unknown itself. Greenland, the ice-covered grave. The settlement of Greenland was perhaps the boldest gamble of the Viking Age. When Eric the Red was exiled from Iceland for manslaughter, he sailed westward in search of a new home. What he found was a land buried under glaciers, fringed with fjords where only narrow strips of green supported life. To sell his colonization scheme, he named it Greenland. A clever lie. The journey there was treacherous. The voyage from Iceland to Greenland spanned over 1,500 kilometers of frigid, storm-ridden sea. Ships battled fog so thick they lost sight of their own oars. Icebergs loomed like mountains out of nowhere, capable of ripping hulls to splinters. Those who survived the crossing faced an even crueler reality. Greenland was a death trap. Winters were long and brutal, with temperatures plummeting far below freezing. Farming was possible, but fragile a bad harvest meant famine. Isolation was total. Once the sea froze, no rescue or trade could reach them, and yet families uprooted their lives to make the crossing. Many never arrived. Others starved within a generation. Greenland was not just a settlement, it was a gamble against nature itself. The Arctic frontier. Even Greenland was not the limit. Viking explorers pushed further north, where the seas turned to slush and the land was blanketed in perpetual snow. They hunted walrus for ivory, prized across Europe, and sought furs from polar foxes. But the Arctic did not welcome intruders. Sea ice trapped ships like Jaws, grinding planks until they splintered. Polar bears stalked camps, attacking at night. Endless nights disoriented men, breaking their minds as much as their bodies. Some ships simply vanished. Others returned years later with half their crew, whispering of storms, starvation, and horrors too great to name. These were not just journeys, they were wagers against the void. Vinland, the land of promise and blood. Perhaps the most legendary of all Viking expeditions was the voyage to Vinland, the mysterious land across the Atlantic, believed today to be part of North America. Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, sailed west from Greenland and found a land rich with forests, wild grapes, and game. To the starving settlers of Greenland, it seemed like paradise. But paradise came at a price. The voyage itself was one of the longest Viking journeys ever attempted over open seas, guided only by stars, birds, and instinct. A single navigational error could doom the entire crew, carrying them into endless ocean with no hope of return. Those who landed in Vinland faced new dangers. They encountered indigenous peoples, the Skrælings, who did not welcome these pale strangers on their shores. Tensions escalated into violence. Viking sagas tell of bloody battles, ambushes, and raids, with the Norse ultimately outnumbered and driven out. Vinland became a land of promise never fully realized, its dangers outweighing its riches. The Vikings never settled it permanently. The terror of the unknown. What made these expeditions uniquely dangerous was not just the physical risk, it was the psychological strain of the unknown. When a ship set sail into waters no one had charted, every creak of timber could feel like a death knell. Every fog bank could hide rocks. Every bird could be a sign of land or a cruel trick. Imagine standing on the deck, weeks from any shore with supplies dwindling. The sea stretches endless in all directions. Your comrades whisper of curses, monsters, and angry gods. And you realize no one alive knows what lies ahead. For many, the unknown was more terrifying than swords or axes. At least in battle, you faced an enemy you could see. Out here, the enemy was invisible, the sea itself. Legends of the far west. Some sagas whisper of lands even beyond Vinland, places where the sun set late, or not at all. Islands where giants dwelled, or where mountains of ice stretched into the heavens. Were these tales real? Archaeologists have found Norse artifacts in far-off places, from Newfoundland to Arctic Canada, suggesting the Vikings pushed further than we once thought. The Vikings knew better than anyone that every journey carried risk. Across seas, across strange lands, and even into death itself, danger was constant, survival uncertain. Yet, they embraced it. Because to them, life wasn't about avoiding peril. It was about facing it with courage, honor, and the will to keep moving forward. And that's why, 1,000 years later, their journeys, both earthly and eternal, are still remembered.